Thank you so much, Anna, for the very kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I appreciate being here with all of you. And congratulations on being Equator Prize winners for 2021 and being a part of these very important dialogues. I feel that the dialogues are um, an integral part of the process because it allows us to expand our networks and connect with each other. So again, I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Tribal Link Foundation. So I'm going to be providing a. I see that you want me to be louder. I don't know if I can get louder, but I'll try to get a little closer. I don't know if that will help. Um, but I'll be sharing a presentation on how Indigenous peoples and local communities can engage in the United Nations system. And apologize if my face is a little closer, but to get closer to the mic, um, I'll have to do that. Um, but let me just first begin by saying Taiwe di tuno kena atia ono diri mukaro agoibana boriken taino daka. Just a quick greeting in my own indigenous language, sharing my name from my indigenous community and also the island homeland where my lineage originates. So if you just allow me one quick moment, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can get this. Okay, I hope you can all see that. And I'll just switch this to slideshow. All right, can you see that now? All right, great. Well, thank you very much for your patience. Just again, I'll be presenting on Indigenous peoples and local communities in the international system. So let me begin uh, with this. Who are Indigenous peoples? So when we use the term Indigenous peoples at the United Nations level, one thing that we have to recall is that there's no set legal definition of Indigenous peoples, but there are several working definitions. And also that Indigenous peoples, when this question came up during negotiations over the years, Indigenous peoples consistently opted for the idea of self-determination and self-identification as Indigenous peoples. So you see this UNDESA uh, working definition. Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained the social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. And then it goes on to talk about, despite cultural differences, we do share, Indigenous peoples around the world do share common problems related to the protection and respect of rights as distinct peoples. So you'll see in this photo, there's various indigenous peoples from around the world highlighted here. So let me also now move to this term, local communities, which is a bit a bit different than indigenous peoples. However, sometimes within this system, they do conflate the terms, and you find some overlap. But we see the same thing where there's no set definition of local or traditional communities. However, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity uses the term indigenous and local communities. So this is in recognition of communities that have a long association with the lands and waters that they have traditionally lived and used over generations. So there's many examples. For example, there may be some communities in France, for example, that can be considered local communities. There are uh, many communities in Asia that are considered local communities, and Brazil in particular has over 1,800 communities that have so far been identified as local or traditional communities, and I have some of at least two of the names of some of them there. But I do want to say one thing about indigenous peoples and local communities. In my own understanding of the terms, I know that indigenous peoples are very adamant in international circles that they are not local communities, and they see a real distinction within the with the use of these two terms. Why? Because one is indigenous peoples, and that's peoples with an S at the end of it. It's very important because that links indigenous peoples to the UN Charter, and which recognizes all peoples have the right to self-determination, etc. You can look at that. So it's different from communities. And the other thing is, when I was looking over, for example, if you look at the bottom of this document, I mentioned a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. Um, there are a lot of rights of local communities defined in that document, or identified or codified in that document. However, there's a distinction between that document and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And one is that in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they recognize the right to free, prior, and informed consent. However, in this United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, they recognize the right to consultation, which is a little bit different. So those are some of the highlights there. But again, this issue is very complex. International law clearly shows that definition is not a prerequisite to protections, and that there are groups. Each of these groups have
Définition n'est pas une condition préalable à la protection et que des
specific rights.
Direitos específicos na lei internacional. Então, a autodeterminação.
Autodeterminación es lo que han estado defendiendo los pueblos indígenas.
Öz arali bir öz aldınca bir hukuk ekeni de düşünüşümüz gerek.
And speak for themselves. So I focus a little bit more on indigenous people. As an indigenous person, I'm more aware of the avenues and the opportunities for indigenous peoples. But I wanted to go back a little bit in history to show you that the engagement in the international system didn't begin with the United Nations, and indigenous peoples actually went to advocate to raise the visibility of their issues at the UN's predecessor, which was the League of Nations. So in 1923, a Haudenosaunee, Chief Descahe, traveled to the League of Nations to defend the rights of his people and bring more visibility to the issues that they were facing. And around the same time period, in 1925, a Maori indigenous leader, Maoris are from the island of Aotearoa, or what we know today as New Zealand, and he also went to the League of Nations to protest the colonist breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so both of these indigenous leaders, what's interesting about this is that both of them felt that they needed to go beyond the national level and bring attention internationally to their situations, because they were not getting the restitution that they felt they needed at that national level. So they felt that bringing it to the international system was the next step. And if you look further in history, at the during the civil rights movement in the United States, for example, Malcolm X also came to this conclusion when he said that we need to go beyond civil rights and go into human rights and engage the United Nations. So I just wanted to add that there. So a lot of indigenous movement from that 1920s. What's interesting is that both of those indigenous leaders did not get in the door. They were not allowed into the League of Nations at that time. So we see some movement over the years, but it really culminates during those 60s and 70s in that those civil rights struggles that were going on. And you really see, especially in the Americas, the occupation of Alcatraz Island. There's a trail of broken treaties. There's the extradition of a human rights defender, Leonard Peltier, from Canada. All these things are going on at the same time as the power movements. If you look in history, you'll see the red power, black power, all of these things that were happening where people were speaking up about their rights and calling for some kind of social justice. So this is where we see a lot of this movement. And right around this time in 1974, indigenous peoples from throughout the hemisphere gathered at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation to talk about their issues. And this was indigenous peoples from North, Central, and South America. And they came up with a manifesto and really an idea following Chief Descaje's approach was to bring their issues to the international system. And around 1977, at a UN conference for discrimination against indigenous peoples in the Americas, indigenous peoples really mobilized and went to Geneva to raise their issues. And out of that meeting, you have the proposals of establishing some kind of document on the collective rights of indigenous peoples, and also revising ILO Convention 107, which ultimately becomes ILO Convention 169. And you see here indigenous peoples at the UN, and also in a procession where, interestingly enough, the leaders in the front of that procession are all spiritual leaders. They're carrying spiritual items along with them to highlight that this was not just a political agenda, but this was also a spiritual agenda for justice in the communities. So there's something else that if you have the opportunity to peruse or read at your leisure, there's a 1981 Martinez Kobo study. This is where that kind of working definition of indigenous peoples appears. And again, you see how Kobo describes indigenous peoples, and it really links the concept of indigenous peoples to colonialism. So he's talking about pre-invasion and pre-colonial communities. And so that's interesting when you talk about local communities as well, because in the Pacific, for example, once these indigenous peoples nations that were formerly colonized reached their independence, now they're not really considered indigenous peoples anymore, but the peoples within their communities are now local communities. So it's very interesting. Again, it's a complex issue, but it's another good report to highlight. Here's just a bit of a timeline of some substantive indigenous peoples activity in the UN system. I've highlighted in 1989 the ILO Convention 169, which we heard about just a few moments ago, and also in 2007, which was the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You also see the working group, the international year, the decades. Also important are the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And these are under the human rights arm of the United Nations, so under the Human Rights Council. You also have the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And these bodies, these three bodies, the Permanent Forum and the Expert Mechanism, rather, those two bodies meet annually. So that's one place where you can follow up and actually participate. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But I wanted to highlight also that when we talk about places of engagement, a very important place of engagement that was in the news quite recently is the climate change and the UNFCCC, or the UN Convention framework on climate change. And so this photo is from 2015. You see me there with my fist in the air. We did an action on the Seine River over there in Paris to raise the visibility of indigenous peoples. And I was part of the outside initiatives, but I was really more focused on the advocacy part. And we were able to actually achieve language in the Paris Agreement that highlights the rights of indigenous peoples, and the rights of local communities were also highlighted there as well. Also of interest to both indigenous peoples and local communities, something else that we fought for was the recognition of traditional knowledge. And so, the Paris Agreement also recognized indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, as well as local communities' traditional knowledge, and they called for the establishment of a local communities and indigenous peoples platform, which is like a knowledge exchange. And I'm happy to say that that platform is now active. I participated in the first activity of the platform, as a co-convener, but right now there's a facilitative working group that's in action, and you can follow up on that. So that here's paragraph 35, which recognizes the need to strengthen the knowledge, technologies, practices, and efforts of local communities and indigenous people. So this is another area that you can follow up with to expand or highlight some of the work that you feel is important related to biodiversity, climate change, sustainable development, and how all of these things integrate the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. The other thing that the other area that I wanted to highlight in this discussion was the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Agenda at the United Nations. And really, this is important as because it's really found across the board. You see everywhere in the agencies and everywhere that you interact, a little kind of rainbow type symbol, and it's all representing this idea of sustainable development goals, which is very important because really at the end of the day, to be quite frank, sustainable development goals are talking about, you know, the among other things, but really the last of what resources are left in the earth, and how people are going to interact and engage with those resources. Some people use the term exploit. I kind of get a little frightened from that term, but you know, how we interact with those resources. And so this is very important for indigenous peoples and local communities to be aware of, because all of the member states of the UN, and when I say member states, I mean the countries that are members of the UN, they all are supposed to be reporting on their progress to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. You see the 17 goals here, kind of put it together in a easily digestible format. But they're supposed to be doing annual updates, and that takes place at UN headquarters. And that's another opportunity for engagement, because engagement of indigenous peoples is mandated under what we call the major groups process. And that was back in 1992 during the first Earth Summit, where they came up with some of these conventions. You know, you have the Sustainable Development Agenda, the Climate Change Agenda, the certification, the Convention on Biological Diversity. All of this stuff kind of emanates from that time period. And so during that time, they identified 9 major groups, of which indigenous peoples were highlighted as one of those groups. And that meant that there should be participation of indigenous peoples in these discussions, and the follow-up at the country level, meaning that that was, in their words, a constituency that needed to be followed up on at the national and local level. So when we get to the Sustainable Development Goals, those major groups are expanded a bit, and others are included, including local communities. So there are specific ways to participate, and each of these forums, I mentioned the Convention on Biological Diversity, which you'll be getting a more in-depth view of that with another speaker at your next session. So I won't go into the Convention of Biological Diversity much here. But there are constituency groups, there's forums for indigenous peoples and others to get involved, and contacting them, getting in touch with them, getting on those mailing lists, and being a part of those discussions will really bring you up to speed on what's going on with the Sustainable Development Goals. The Climate Change Convention also has a similar grouping for indigenous peoples, and the Convention on Biological Diversity again, and you'll hear more about this when you get that presentation. So I mentioned the Human Rights Council and some of the opportunities for indigenous peoples that take place there. And so here I just wanted to highlight, because this is another opportunity for participation, which is the treaty bodies. And treaty bodies are the committees of independent experts in charge of monitoring the implementation by the state parties or the countries of the rights protected in international human rights treaties. Again, so these are committees of experts, and they're the ones who are mandated to do the follow-up to see that states are adhering to what they agreed to and committed to in these international human rights treaties. So there's 9 core international human rights treaties that deal with civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, also racial discrimination, torture, discrimination against women, child rights, migrant workers, persons with disabilities, and enforced disappearances. So many of the functions of the treaty, the main function rather of the treaty bodies are to examine periodic reports, just reporting. The UN does a lot of reporting. So in other words, you have this group of countries that are coming to the UN and they're getting involved in multilateral or collaborative efforts. And they commit to certain agreements, which are treaties or other constructive agreements, and then they report on the progress of achieving those goals that they set. So these treaty bodies really examine periodic reports by countries, and they adopt concluding observations, and also they consider individual complaints. So this is a mechanism that's really important for people who unfortunately suffer human rights abuses. They have complaint mechanisms to kind of raise the visibility of those violations of human rights within this system. So concluding observations contain reviews of both positive and negative aspects, so it's not just the violations, but this is again talking about the state implementation of the provision of treaties, and they also provide recommendations for improvement. And so the other thing is that the treaty bodies adopt general comments, which are interpretations of the treaties. In other words, they further explain or provide guidance on how states can really interact with these treaties, or how they should be based on international standards. So a large number of these treaty bodies may have made general comments reference specifically to indigenous peoples. I'm not so clear on the term local communities, but this could be followed up with. And so to date, however, only the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Committee on the Rights of the Child have adopted general comments specifically addressing indigenous peoples' rights. And I know that I've been involved through my work with International Treaty Council specifically in both of these areas. And it is an important process to learn about and be a part of, especially if you have concern for indigenous rights or what's happening on the ground back in your home countries. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is also preparing a general recommendation on the rights of indigenous women and girls for adoption in 2022, so that's something to look out for. And it's also probably important to note that the COVID pandemic deeply impacted the activities of the treaty bodies in 2020. So while there was 123 state party reports that were submitted, only 27 concluding observations were adopted, and 97 lists of issues were prepared. So, but despite the limited number of concluding observations, the committees continued to remind state parties of their obligations to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, in particular to life, equality, non-discrimination, including their collective rights to access, own, use, develop, and control their lands, territories, and resources, as well as that free, prior, and informed consent, right to free, prior, and informed consent. So you can get a compilation of all these materials. They're available on the OHCHR website, or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, participation at the international level is where I'll be concluding my presentation. So there's various ways that you can also engage here with these at the international level. One is the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, and that offers financial support in the form of grants, and these grants aim to help indigenous community representatives participate in the UN mechanisms that I mentioned, the Permanent Forum, also the MRIP, and now they've also expanded it to participate in other forums like the UNFCCC, for example. So any member of an indigenous community can apply for a grant to participate. So you go to the website, they have a form, you fill out that form, and if you're, if you're fortunate enough, you get picked from amongst the applicants, and you'll be able to participate, have the funds to participate in those meetings. When we started out advocating at the UN, a lot of these funds weren't really in existence, and so we had to really raise funds on our own. But fortunately, over time, we've seen some incremental progress over the years, and this has supported participation in spaces where they're talking about our rights, which is very important. You want to hear what's going on and what they're saying about you, because ultimately it's going to affect what's happening on the ground. There's also the Convention on the Biological Diversity Voluntary Fund, so that also facilitates the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. So if you don't self-identify as indigenous peoples, but rather consider yourself a local community representative, you can participate and apply to that fund as well. Some other funds and programs that are some other programs, rather, not funds, but that are of interesting for you to note is one, the Indigenous Fellowship Program, and that's a comprehensive human rights training program that was established by the Office of the High Commissioner, as well as the Fellowship for People of African Descent, and also the Minorities Fellowship Program. So these are all comprehensive human rights training programs. You just go to the website. Again, you follow the protocol and procedures for being a part of the program. Right now, I'm not sure how they are reconciling COVID protocols with the programs, but you'll have to follow up. And once things are more stabilized, I'm sure that folks will be able to participate regularly again. Many people that I know that have participated in the Indigenous Fellowship Program speak of it highly. And there's finally also other ways that you can seek support, and that would be through the support of ally organizations and non-governmental organizations. So I would recommend, if you have not done so already, that you try to find the national organizing bodies for indigenous peoples or NGOs in your area. Try to tap into those networks so that you can be aware of upcoming opportunities. For example, I'm here today on behalf of the Tribaling Foundation, and we try to, when we can raise the money to do so, engage and provide capacity building programs for indigenous peoples to prepare them for engagement at, let's say, the Permanent Forum or other bodies. And so I would recommend that you would have to do some research and find out, but the Equator Initiative team and the Creative Prize team can really help you tap into some of these networks, and that's why it's good to remain connected and really follow up on some of the things that they're putting out there. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. If you want to connect with me outside of this forum, I'm on Instagram, I'm also on Twitter, and I urge you to connect with me in that way. And I hope that I haven't gone over my time, but I think I was supposed to leave some time for some questions, so I hope we have a little bit of time for that. So I say ha home, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Roberto. Absolutely, you did not go over your time, and also it is so inspiring to always hear from you, and we're so grateful for you to share your profuse knowledge about all of this. I mean, I believe this can be really useful. I mean, at least to me, and I'm sure to many more here on the audience today. So we now have about 10 to 15 minutes, I'd say, to use for Q&As. So if anybody here in the audience has a question for Roberto, we'd like to invite you to share your questions either by raising your hand or by dropping the question in the chat, whatever feels best to you. please don't be shy. There is interpretation, so anything can be interpreted by our wonderful team of interpreters here today, and Roberto will be happy to take any question you might have. No question is considered silly, or just feel free to share and to ask away.
Yes, and I also want to thank my dear brother and friend Kapak Konde. He also made a clarification that was very important, and that's duly noted. In the limited time, I didn't have time to go into all the details, so I'm glad that he shared here about the Convention on Biological Diversity, and he notes there that in 2014, in line with the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Conference of the Party decided to use the term Indigenous Peoples and local communities in future discussions under the convention without affecting in any way the legal meaning of Article 8J and the related provisions. So, that's important to note, that separation. And so thank you very much, Kapak, for really highlighting that and expanding on what I shared. I appreciate that. And also there are some links that were put into the chat as well. And Nina also mentions that it's good to see Chief Raoni. Yes, I had some photos of our time together during the Paris meeting for the Paris climate change meeting. He's an inspiring indigenous leader, getting very advanced in age. So I would recommend that if you have an opportunity, read a little bit about him and what he stood for over the years. He also has a foundation that was established to further his work and vision, and that might be another place where you might be able to collaborate or find some support in the future. Great.
Roberto, would you mention something about the course, the project access training and the project access online? Yeah, please, thank you.
I just the oversight on my part, but I'm glad that we have a few minutes more so that we can mention this. We talk about partnerships and networking, and you all who are participating in the call are part of that dynamic now, part of the partnerships and networking. Oftentimes, over the years, as I've participated in the various forums, what I've seen is that many indigenous peoples in particular arrive to a place like the United Nations with some preconceived notions. In other words, we see the UN in what we see on the media. We develop these kind of preconceived notions of what the UN is, what it can do, and how it could actually affect change. And sometimes, people have positive views of the UN. Sometimes people have negative views of the UN. But I noticed that when over the years, as indigenous peoples who have really had no interaction or engagement with the UN system before they arrive to participate in a forum like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which didn't have a kind of constituency body associated with it. It's a little different from the Convention on Biological Diversity, where there's a grouping of indigenous peoples who have been participating. They're there and they can kind of help orientate new folks coming in to the process, update you on what's going on, etc. The same thing that you have in the UN FCCC. But what we developed with the Tribal Link Foundation and through the vision of our recently dear departed executive director and founder, Pamela Kraft, was that what we were hearing is that indigenous peoples really wanted more opportunity for capacity building when they get to the UN and participate in, let's say, a permanent forum, so that they don't come away as frustrated. I'm not going to say that's going to alleviate all your frustrations. The UN is not the silver bullet that solves everybody's problem. Let's be realistic and just very open about that. However, it can really help and affect changes on the ground, and you could see by being part of the Equator Prize that it can help, and it raises the visibility of what you're doing. So there is utility to being part of the process, and our elders knew that long ago, since the time of Descaje. So we developed in Tribal Link Foundation in cooperation and collaboration with UNDP, Learning for Nature Initiative, our friends from the Equator Initiative, developed this course. It's a free online introductory course called Indigenous Peoples in the International System, Project Access Online. And it's available in various languages, Spanish, French, Portuguese, of course English. And you can engage and really get a more in-depth view of what I just presented today, similar to what I just presented today. You'll get some history. You'll really get into each of the areas that we were talking about. You'll see Kapak on the Convention of Biological Diversity presentation, the special rapporteur, some very well-known indigenous activists like Andrea Carmen from the International Indian Treaty Council and others who talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how you can engage in these areas more effectively. And at the end of each section, you have materials that you can download and that you can save and use that when you want to refresh your memory, or if you're going to be participating in something in particular, you can really connect and remind yourself through those downloadable information sheets that are provided. And finally, you get to take a little quiz that kind of helps you remember what you learned in the course in that section. And then at the end, you get a certificate of completion for taking part in that course. So it's a nice way of saying that you completed something, but also that you've engaged in this process that's larger than yourself, and you've connected now to this international movement of indigenous peoples. And so I would recommend that there's shared here in the chat section in various languages, information about the course that you can follow up on. And this is just something else that you can be in. And what's good about this, besides being free, is that you could take, it's a self-paced course, which means that you don't have to finish it all in one sitting. Some of these modules might take, a few hours to get through, and you might not have that kind of time at one sitting, but you can come to it, sign in, be a part of the program, engage in some of the online discussions, and then, finish it at your opportunity and your pace. So again, thank you, Nina, for reminding me. I should have had that in my presentation, but I'm happy that we had the opportunity to present this as well. Mind if I just excuse me while I take a little sip of water?
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Nina. Nina, you were going to say something, but I think this was very useful, like for you to share. And as you said, the course is self-paced and is available in several languages. So we really want to encourage each one of you to watch it at your leisure. You will get a certificate at the end. So we hope it can be helpful. Let's see. Marcelo wrote something in the chat. Okay, he's thanking you, Roberto. Great, wonderful presentation, and he's going to be useful to widen their knowledge. Marcelo from Coopera Cerrado is saying thank you, Marcelo, for commenting on the chat. So Roberto was also. Oh, somebody is trying to ask a question, please. Please share your name. Hello. We cannot hear you at this moment. I think it's Burul trying to say something. Burul, we cannot hear you. Can you hear us? as Burul tries to sort out her internet connection, I will also say that, and thank you, Roberto, again, for also sharing his email address. Perhaps you want to put it in the chat here, Roberto, just in case any of our Equator Prize winners will come up with questions at a later time, or if any of them who have bad connection at the moment want to just follow up with you over email. I think that will be useful. Oh, okay, no worries, Burul. All right then, so Roberto, many thanks again. I'll say what we can do is start our break now and resume in about 15 minutes. And then we'll open our last segment of today's 5th session of this community dialogues. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Roberto, for the wonderful presentation, and speak to everyone in 15 minutes.